assistant professor in public policy of Excluded Populations, School for Global Inclusion and Social Development, University of Massachusetts, Boston. Sorry for reading it, but it's long. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
I was thinking about working from now backwards a little bit, because the latest news is the federal holiday that has just been approved and signed by the president, a cause for celebration for all people, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, it is really wonderful news. I think a lot of people have been wanting to see that come to fruition. And so it felt like a fulfillment of people's long struggles.
And yeah, but it's been a long time in coming, hasn't it?
That it certainly has, for sure.
You wrote a very good commentary, a couple of them actually, that appeared in the New Hampshire Business Review, which I read. And it talked about the disadvantages that people of color have. Maybe you could expand on that.
Sure. So, I mean, the piece was co-written with my husband. Excuse me.
Right.
Pardon me.
No problem.
Yeah, so the piece was co-written with my husband, and I should actually give a lot of credit to him because he was the lead author on the piece. And he really came to me with the idea of wanting to write something about essentially responding firstly to HB 544 and the argument that was being made by some of the representatives in Concord, saying that actually there isn't a need for us to be talking about these issues because this isn't a problem. And most sort of immediately what had activated Dan Weeks, my husband, to want to write this piece was the statement by the governor saying that systemic racism isn't a problem in New Hampshire. And so, Dan was like, I think that the governor is wrong on this. But more than that, he realized that there actually wasn't a really good source where you could find all of these statistics pulled together. So, you could find bits and pieces in different places, but you couldn't necessarily find all of it in the same place. And so really wanted to present a picture for people who maybe are sympathetic to the argument that, yes, this is a problem, right, in the United States at large, but it's not a problem here in the Granite State. And so that was where the piece originated from.
Interesting. I was reading the House bill, and it's got a lot of controversy. It's tied, as you know, to the budget. And
right.
it might get unraveled from the budget, and they're still wrangling over that.
Correct.
Yes. It's an incredible situation to have that on the floor, really.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if your listeners would be aware, probably many of them are, that, the language of House Bill 544 actually is language that is almost cut and paste from an executive order that was adopted and signed by the prior president of the United States, which essentially was sort of defending what was called patriotic history, and taking a stance against any kind of teaching of issues around discrimination that make certain groups feel badly about their identities and their role in history. And it has come to be referred to by the shorthand that is that it's basically kind of advocating against like critical race theory informed approach to the teaching of history and civics in the United States. However, of course, anybody who knows about critical race theory would respond very strongly to say that the bill does not actually speak doesn't say anything really about critical race theory, because it clearly misunderstands what critical race theory is. And I guess I would say that the most fundamental misunderstanding is that, the people who adopt the former president's view that, racism and sexism would stop being a problem if we just stop talking about them, are missing the fact that actually, we're not talking about something that's just an interpersonal issue, right? And when they highlight and emphasize the fact that when you talk about racism in terms of the ways in which it systemically privileges certain groups of people, particularly white people and men, then you're making people feel badly about themselves and making people feel badly about being white. That's a fundamental misunderstanding of what's at issue, because the issue isn't so much about making people feel badly, and I don't think anybody wants to make anybody feel badly. It's about the fact that there are endemic and persistent inequalities that are riddled throughout society, whether or not the people who are working in those positions, whether at government or in professional environments, or in, education spaces, are themselves racist, right? Like the impacts of inequality are so baked into the system that they actually, manifest no matter the intentions of the people who are, administering whatever those policies and practices are. And so, to focus on making certain people feel badly is to miss the point quite fundamentally, especially because, the people who suffer from systemic racism and systemic sexism and all of the rest of the isms, that fundamentally and systemically discriminate against people at a structural level, those people aren't just concerned about having hurt feelings when somebody says something racist against you. Those people are fundamentally concerned about the fact that, the American dream is not available to people of certain demographics, almost regardless of their efforts. And that is just as a function of their having a certain skin type or having certain, genitalia associated with a particular sex, right? And so that is fundamentally contradictory to what America stands for and who America says that it is. And so that's the key issue at hand.
You live in New Hampshire and you teach in Boston, so you see, I don't know, I think both sides of rural and metropolitan life. I think I like to say that I have as well.
Yeah.
And I like to think that I'm not a racist, and that I was taught at the age of 15 by meeting a person of color and then going to university full of people with different colors, nationalities, then coming here. I guess without reflecting on myself, you are in a primarily white state, aren't you? Yeah.
That is indeed correct. Yes, I think, I mean, I can share a little bit of my background. So I'm originally from South Africa, and first visited New Hampshire in 2008 because my husband, Dan Weeks, who is, as he likes to say, a 12th generation Granite Stater, he grew up in New Hampshire, and he wanted to come back home. And he and I had met in the UK in graduate school. And I joked that I had never even heard of New Hampshire when I met him. And so, to come to New Hampshire and, for a while, I would say to him, why couldn't you have been from California? At least I've heard of California, And so, the thought of coming to New Hampshire, which is relatively small, relatively, homogenous, and we would joke often actually that whenever I would leave, because for about 3 years we were in a long distance relationship, that the population of people of color in New Hampshire would drop by like, 33%. And so, like I moved here in 2013 when we finally set down roots here, knowing very consciously that, I was moving to a state that self-identifies as predominantly a white state and is demographically a predominantly a white state, although a lot of New Hampshire's history of diversity, even though it exists and is very deep and goes a long way back, is just not highlighted. It's just not spoken about. It's not that it's not there. New Hampshire, before it was, lily white New Hampshire was the home of, thriving Native American populations, right? And those are considered today people of color. And there are still some living Native American communities in the Granite State. And then, of course, New Hampshire actually was the site of slavery and indentured servitude. And so, there is a long history of people of African descent and people of multiple different, heritages living in New Hampshire. And so even though New Hampshire is still predominantly a white state, it is also a very diverse state.
Have you had an opportunity to visit the African burying ground in Portsmouth?
Indeed. Actually, we were there on Saturday for the Juneteenth celebration. They had a wonderful, sort of ceremony where they remembered the bodies of the people who were buried there, the African people who were buried there, and then also had some wonderful festivities with dancing and drumming and what have you.
And I followed the building of that and the very impressive cost of doing that. And if I may say, and as an observation, it wasn't just people of color that contributed to that large fund. It was white people as well.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's one of the cool things too about what the Black Heritage Trail does is, that organization, in fact, many of the volunteers who were there and hosting and facilitating the proceedings on Saturday are people of European descent. And so I don't think that these issues are necessarily racialized issues in the sense that I think there are people of, both European and African and, indigenous and Asian and other identities, at least who are descendants from those places, who are engaged in these conversations on both sides. And there are certainly a lot of Granite Staters who, would be described as white or would even self-describe as white, who are opposed to, HB 544, which is now part of, House Bill 2, which is the budget, because they recognize that it's actually really important for all of our kids to learn these truths about our history, and that you can't solve a problem if you sweep it under the rug. The first thing that you learn in whatever, course or, therapy or counseling or whatever process you go through about resolving issues is that the first thing you have to overcome is denial, right? You have to accept it and acknowledge it. In reverse order, actually acknowledge and accept it, and only then can you actually really address that. And I think a lot of people recognize that, people even who are of European descent.
I was reading the transcript of a Washington Post podcast, and it was said, I forget the name of it, I'm sorry, The New Normal, I think, and that we have white blame. We should, blame ourselves. But okay, I find it hard to blame myself because I don't perceive that there was anybody in my forebears that were slave owners or slave traders. I might be wrong though.
Yeah, that's an important question that I think a lot of people struggle with. What I have found helpful in these conversations is to not so much focus on blame, because I think that that can be an obstacle. It can stand in the way of having productive conversations and moving forward. I rather want to start with the data, right? And agree on the fact that there is a problem, that we both are seeing the same problem, right? And the problem, as I would very briefly articulate it, which is what we summarized in the article, is that the ways in which society is structured have the unfortunate and distressing and unequal effects of making white people the beneficiaries of the system as it stands, and people of color, to different degrees, right, depending on how Black they are or how removed they are from whiteness, their life chances and access to, you name it, education, health, prosperity, their access and their benefit from those opportunities are proportionate with the amount of whiteness or Blackness in their skin, right? And then if you look at sexism, similarly so. And so I think it's not helpful to talk about blame. It's more helpful to say, so we are both observing a phenomenon where, whether or not the people who, are in power are deliberately doing this, and I'm more than happy to attribute a generous view, give a charitable perspective that says that none of them are intending to do harm, right? Yet even so, harm continues to occur. So how do we work together to overcome that harm, recognizing that there are some people who are consistently benefiting, as contrasted with some people who are more consistently being harmed and disadvantaged by the system as it stands. And so, and one of the things that I think gets lost in the conversation often is that, even though we are talking about disparate harm, right, the system of racism and sexism definitely does more harm to Black people, Black and Indigenous and people of color, depending on how far removed they are from whiteness, right? And does more benefit and more substantially benefits white people or people who are of European descent, right? However, that's not the same as saying that the system is good for white people, right? Because what often gets lost is that racism harms everybody, right? Like, there are fascinating studies that have been done about the ways in which, white people themselves, if they are informed by racist beliefs, right, actually vote in ways that are negative for their own purposes, right? They for instance, they vote against investment in public infrastructure that would actually be beneficial to everybody, not just Black people, not just immigrants, right? And so that is a form of harm for themselves. Or, even in the hearings around HB 544, HB 2, right, here in New Hampshire, one of the most poignant stories I heard in the testimonies was a doctor who I believe works for Dartmouth Hitchcock, right? And he said, one of the ways in which he has seen racism actually really do harm to European people of European descent is that he, as a doctor of Asian descent, right, he serves a population up in in Coos County where there isn't very much medical access. And yet sometimes people who literally have nowhere else to go will say, no, I don't want to be seen by you because you are a person of color. Is that not a form of harm for that person who is standing before an Indian doctor and yet rejects the services that could be life preserving for them because they hold to a racist view of the world, right? That's like the most immediate example of how racism harms everybody, even white people. And so I think it's really important for us to not focus on who's guilty and who's not, because frankly, at the end of the day, and this is what critical race theory I think is really good at articulating, is that because the system is rigged so as to be to produce disparate effects based on racial classification, everybody is complicit in racism. So in a sense, we're all guilty, right? We are all guilty for contributing to a system that perpetuates racism and perpetuates sexism. However, if we step away from focusing on that, we can have more productive conversations by talking about the fact that we have an opportunity to collaborate to ensure maximal advantage for everybody. And we do that by, working together to eliminate all of those barriers, those artificial barriers that are put in place by things like racism and sexism.
As an educator, how would you like to see American history taught differently?
Oh, wow. One of the first books that I read on American history that I found really compelling was Lies My Teacher Told Me. And it's a book about it sort of is told around certain sort of pivotal moments in American history that are sort of canonical, right? Like everybody kind of knows about them and thinks about them in a very particular way because of how they've been taught. But actually, those stories are really incomplete. And those stories are in many ways very misleading, deceptive. And so, for instance, one is the story of Christopher Columbus discovering America, right? I mean, there are cities and I think some states even at this point that have now renamed Columbus Day Indigenous Peoples Day because of the fact that there's an awareness that this idea of talking about Columbus as having discovered America is problematic because it essentially sort of eliminates the indigenous people from the narrative of America's existence and formation. But also it doesn't, recognize the fact that there had been Asian explorers who had actually come to America before. There had been African explorers who had come to America before Christopher Columbus, right? It takes one European man and makes him the epitome of the discovery and formation of this nation, right? And so I would love to see, history taught in ways that are just more complex, right? In ways that just are much less simplistic, right? We like the story of the single hero or heroine. It's mostly hero, but sometimes it's heroine, right? And the story of this one explorer and enterprising individual who defies all the odds. But the reality is that all of us, we live in a world that's complicated, right? Where no individual is both good and bad, right? And so I would love to see history taught in ways that help us as individuals and as a society to live with the tensions and ambiguities and contradictions of what life as human beings actually encompasses by matter of necessity. And, I would apply that not just to the big heroines, such as, Christopher Columbus, who's an easy sort of scapegoat, but for instance, Martin Luther King too, right? Who is a Black hero, who many of us as people of color revere and think is wonderful when our white brothers and sisters celebrate him and draw quotes from him or whatever. But often we talk about him in ways that sort of flatten his character, flatten his humanity, right? Because he actually was a very complicated person, right? So some of what he said was, very, very progressive and welcome, but some of it was controversial, even in at his time, like in his time, and some of his behavior, right, was contradictory to some of what he subscribed to as being, his beliefs and values. And I think it's important for us to teach our children a version of history that allows them to see that they have permission to be both great and flawed at the same time. And that is actually the story of all heroes, is that they wrestle with their inner demons, and that they contribute to history in complicated ways, and that decades or centuries later, people will come back and question what they did, which at the time that they did it may have been the stuff of heroes, but now is actually looked back on, and even when some people say he was just a man of his time, some people say no, actually there were people who were against slavery at his time, and so it's actually not okay to say Christopher Columbus or who's a good example? Jefferson, right? Or even Washington was just a man of his time, right? Because even at that time, there were voices that were loudly saying slavery is wrong. And so, it's important for us to bring together these nuances and these complexities and contradictions, and contestations, so that our children grow up to understand what it means to be human, and what it means to contribute to society that's made up of complex beings and complex histories.
I'm going to wrap up soon, but I just wanted to ask you this. I don't have any belief that I will see great improvement in my lifetime, because I'm closer to the end than you, and you're closer to the beginning. What about you? Do you think that constructive change can happen?
I think constructive change can happen. And, I'm so encouraged by the fact that I think constructive change already is happening. I mean, George Floyd's murder was a watershed. It really was. I think for so many of us who are people of color, it was just devastating. But I think also for a lot of our brothers and sisters who are people of European descent, it was also devastating. It essentially took the scales off of people's eyes, and they saw more clearly for the first time that systemic racism isn't, it isn't benign, right? In the words of Ta-Nehisi Coates, we talk about racism in sort of very in ways that have been sort of are devoid of the horror of what it actually represents. And he says we need to talk about racism as something that is the gnashing of teeth, the breaking of bones, the like shedding of blood, right? Because that's what racism looks like. And I think that's what the George Floyd moment was, is a recognition of the fact that racism isn't benign. It is, the taking of life in very brutal and painful ways. And as I said earlier in our discussion, I think that, as so much research and scholarship and teaching tells us, we start to see change when we start by acknowledging that there is a problem, and accepting it and recognizing it, and agreeing to work towards something better. And I think that that's the moment we're in. Some people have said that we're in a moment somewhat like the civil rights movement, period. I don't know if I would be that bold as to say that, but I do think that we are in a moment of tectonic shift, and that makes me hopeful. I don't think that we are going to see all of the change that we want to see. Statistically, actually, they say that if America keeps going at the rate that it's going right now, it will close the racial inequality gap in 200 and I think 63 years, roughly. So, I'm hopeful that if nothing else, we won't be going backwards, and we will close the gap in 263 years. However, if I am also hopeful that if, people keep advocating and agitating and, working together, as we're seeing happening in this moment in history, we might actually even be able to have that, or, achieve those goals in a quarter of the time. So I am hopeful. It probably won't happen in my lifetime, but I am hopeful that we will see some movement and some change.